with us from the University of Otago, from the Department of Politics, Professor Robert Patman. Robert, good evening. I'm going to think of these time frames we're doing now for the show. Good evening and welcome back to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
As always, we look to our go-tos, to our experts to come and give us some advice on what's going on in the news. And when it comes to international politics, you are not only our go-to guy, but go-to guy for much of New Zealand media. So there is a lot of headlines. There's a lot of headlines about a lot of stuff going on at the moment. One of the things going on is China in the Pacific. China coming into the Pacific. What's happening with China in the Pacific? So I thought if we can grab you for 10 minutes, we can have a chat about it. We can have a chat about what is the good, what are the bads, is this something to worry about, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're okay, could you just talk to me like I'm 9 years old? Because that's about my mentality. And just explain for everyone who may be not as deep into this whole political world as others, what exactly is going on with the whole headlines about China and the Pacific and what the concerns are that are being raised.
Well, the New Zealand government and the Australian government have been concerned about the growing role of China for some time. For example, a New Zealand Defence Ministry statement identified China as a possible threat to the international rules-based order with respect to the Pacific Island states. And that was 2018, as I said before. But what's brought it into sharp focus now, and the reason it's dominating the headlines, is that firstly, there was a bilateral initiative by China, which was a security deal with the Solomon Islands. Mm-hmm. Australia already has a security deal with the same country, but there was concerns because the deal with China seemed to contravene a declaration that all Pacific Island states had signed up to in 2000, which is when it comes to security in the region, states agreed to coordinate and discuss their mutual concerns. Right. Whereas it seems like the Solomon Islands basically responded to initiative, or even maybe encouraged China. We don't know. But the point is that they signed a deal with China, and China is obviously outside the Pacific Island region. And that seemed to contravene the 2000 Pacific Islands Declaration or Forum Declaration. Then the second, hot on the heels of the concern about the Solomons China deal, in which, by the way, the New Zealand government described as worrying and also as a potential militarization of the region. Hot on the heels of that, China followed up with a really ambitious multilateral economic and security package, which was being offered to 10 countries, 10 Pacific Island states.
Right.
And there was concerns here because what was really striking was that this aid package there was a linkage in it between economic and security assistance. In other words, the recipients couldn't just say, "Oh, thanks for the economic assistance, but I think I'll say no to the security." They didn't have that option. Right. And that sensitized, I think, or made New Zealand and Australia and the United States worried. What they saw in this linked agreement, this multifaceted agreement, multilateral initiative, what they saw was a barely veiled attempt by China to establish a sphere of influence in the Pacific Island states.
So what it sounds like you're saying is the countries around the Pacific have an agreement, basically like, if anything's going on, come talk to us first. Almost like we've got the first right of refusal. Come talk to us first.
Well, and also because any deal with an outside power has implications for others.
Yeah, and so one of the group has gone out. I'm almost thinking like a sports team, how someone has agreed to play for a team and then they're signed with another team without just kind of ignoring a contract. And then the other thing is, so China's got in with the Solomons with an agreement. Now they've gone, now we can have a look around at some of the other players in the game and we can offer them assistance as well. But it comes with little fishhooks that our military or our security needs to be into those areas as well as the economic advantages. Is that pretty much the synopsis?
Yeah, I mean, there's a linkage between what in the package China is offering. It's a pretty comprehensive package, and you are in or out. Now, what we know, this is what China was proposing, and it doesn't look like there's going to be too many takers. So there's been a bit of pushback. In fact, the pushback happened before Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi could actually begin his tour of these Pacific Island states. And the leader of the Federation of Micronesia made it quite clear that he believed this was an attempt to interfere in the internal affairs of the Pacific Island states. And I don't think, although the president of Micronesia has been outspoken, I think there's quite a few Pacific Island state leaders who also agree. But China has signed some agreements with the likes of Samoa and now Solomons, and has an agreement with Fiji. So, yeah, I mean, I think that I suppose the concern from the West is not, well, I say the West, the concern for New Zealand, Australia, and the United States is that China is an authoritarian system. And if it manages to get part of this deal accepted, it may use that as leverage to begin to erode the democratic systems that exist and promote, if you like, strong leaders that they approve of.
Yeah, right. What I think we might do is have a bit of a look at a little bit of commentary that's coming out today. The first was Christopher Luxon on TVNZ today. He was asked the question, basically, are you concerned about China in the Pacific? This is what Mr. Luxon had to say.
Well, look, I mean, I think it is, threatening peace and stability in the Pacific. I think you've really got to ask two questions. What is the state of our relationships with the Pacific Island nations, what we think they are versus what they actually are? And I think the second thing is that we want to see Minister Mahuta out there engaging with the Pacific Islands. It was really interesting to me that Penny Wong, 24 hours after being appointed Australia's Foreign Minister, is straight away on a plane up to Fiji and around the Pacific. The US has had representatives engaging with the Pacific Islands as well. As we heard yesterday in the House, in Parliament here, it didn't feel like the minister had actually spoken to leaders of those nations in the previous 72 hours. So, I think New Zealand needs to be out and engaged, and picking up the phone and in dialogue with these leaders.
So you're saying that if you were the Prime Minister, you would have your Foreign Minister there, and if so, what would you be saying to your Foreign Minister?
Well, look, absolutely. I mean, I have Jerry Brownlee up there right now, and I know Jerry, it was the first place he went to when he was Foreign Minister before. And, we're just about building relationships and actually understanding how we build a partnership with each of those individual countries. And so I think there's quite a lot that New Zealand could offer each of those countries and continue to deepen those relationships that we have.
So the other thing I also wanted to play is some of the response coming out of the Pacific. It sounded like you're saying that some of the Pacific are kind of shooting down the idea before it even arrives. This is the leader of Fiji's opposition party, and he talks about there being quite a lot of anxiety within Fiji about this, I don't know if I can call it a Chinese incursion, but the Chinese attempts to gain a bigger foothold in the Pacific.
There's a lot of anxiety within the Pacific community on this relationship with China, given the current geopolitical situation in the Northern Pacific. China is becoming very assertive, and we are not very comfortable with what it could lead to, as most of us, Fiji in particular, and my party in particular, wants to stay closely in matters of security with our big neighbors, Australia and New Zealand, our traditional allies, and the United States.
So there was some commentary from a politician out of Fiji as well. I've got lots of questions based off the back of this. The first one has Minister Mahuta dropped the ball here? Because I sometimes we in the public don't really know what the oppositional party, whoever that was on the day, is using as kind of fodder, and when they're making a fair and cogent point. So is Nanaia Mahuta moving too slowly on this? Is the government moving too slowly on this, in your opinion?
Well, Nanaia Mahuta made it an absolute priority when she became Foreign Minister to develop the relationship we have with the Pacific Island states. She has been restricted by some COVID protocols.
Yeah.
And the other thing to note here, I noticed that Christopher Luxon said that we should sort of emulate the Australians, new government of Australia, and Penny Wong, the Australian Foreign Minister, has certainly been out there. And I think it's quite a reasonable idea that, Nanaia Mahuta, provided she can get agreement to be received and all that sort of thing, should go out there as soon as possible. But our situation is completely different from Australia's.
Right.
That comment was suggesting that both parties are struggling in their relations with the Pacific. I don't accept that. Australia was struggling because under the Scott Morrison government, it was failing to address really important, crucial core concerns of many Pacific Island states, like climate change.
Right.
New Zealand itself can do much more, but the big beef that the Pacific Island states had with the Morrison government was that it was not empathetic, in fact, ignored issues which they consider to be an existential threat to their life in the Pacific Island states. So I think it's very important to clarify that. Now, the Foreign Minister Mahuta has said that she's been in constant dialogue through electronic means on a virtually day basis. So, it's nice to have a visit there. But if we take her word, and that she has been in constant contact with all the leaders of the Pacific Island states, and I have no reason to doubt it because she said that was a major foreign policy priority of her government.
Yep.
It may explain why the Chinese initiative hasn't flown or hasn't been as successful as the Chinese may have hoped. And I think there is in the Australian case, there is a sense of trying to make up for lost time. I mean, Penny Wong didn't pull any punches about that. She said the previous government had neglected the concerns of the Pacific Island states.
It seems much like with, I guess, a lot of negotiation. I'm thinking of that saying, it might be a little bit naive, that any man has its price, like any country has its price. I mean, if it seems that we need to be the attractive option. Like, why do the Solomons go with China? We need to be the attractive option. How do we become the attractive option? And I'm also thinking, do any of the Pacific Islands or do any of our kind of Pacific neighbours feel that there's a little bit of hypocrisy because we have a free trade deal agreement with China, which means we are getting the economic benefits here in New Zealand, and maybe they're going, well, we want our bite of the pie as well. So how do we work that all out and make it fair that New Zealand gets a massive economic benefit from China. Pacific Islands want that too, but their deal comes with fish hooks, whereas ours maybe doesn't quite have the same fish hooks in it, if you know what I'm saying.
Two quick points there. I think that certain leaders in the Pacific Island states are more attracted to China for domestic political reasons. They want Chinese support for their style of government, so-called strongman leaders.
Right.
And Mr. Sogavari, the current leader of the Solomons, has been identified as one leader who sees quite a nice fit between his style of leadership and China's hands-off, non-interference in domestic affairs position and the lack of concern about human rights. And Mr. Sogavari switched the Solomons from Taiwan until he took power. The Solomon Islands was linked to Taiwan, and then it switched under his leadership to China. So that's a concern. And the second point I would make is that, and I think you really hit it on the head here, is that when you're small and weak, and these are microstates, you're trying to get help wherever you can get it.
Mm.
And viewed through their eyes, and these are sovereign states, the upsurge of geopolitical rivalry between the US and the United States, between the United States and China, is actually an opportunity, because it means US, Australia and New Zealand have had the Pacific Island states all to themselves for much of the post-45 period. Suddenly, China becomes an economic superpower, a global superpower, and it wants all the perks that go with that status, including spreading its wings in the Pacific Island area. And from the point of view of the Solomon Islands and other countries, they think, well, actually, this might be a way of maximizing support for our country.
Yeah.
It was very interesting watching Mr. Sogavari's reaction when he was questioned about why he'd signed the deal with China. He said, look, we're a sovereign state. We've already got a security agreement with Australia, so we've now decided to have one with China. And the two don't conflict. These are his words. And we will not have a Chinese military base. Now, that may be for public consumption. We don't know. But it's interesting, the logic behind it. So I think the answer to your question is that the countries like New Zealand and Australia must be very careful to respond to Chinese competition, not by a top-down response saying to the Pacific Island states, we're coming to protect you against the Chinese peril,
Yeah.
because that will play into the hands of the Chinese. They, in fact, what they have to do is address very real concerns of the Pacific Island states, like climate change, and empower them, give them the wherewithal and choices so that they can resist encroachments from China. In other words, they have to be given support. And I think the Prime Minister was very, very shrewd when she has said that her response to Chinese involvement by a violation of regional rules. And it set a very bad precedent. And also the Foreign Minister Mahuta and Jacinda Ardern have both said that the whole Chinese package should be discussed before anything signed up amongst all regional actors, because they're all going to be affected by it. And that discussion should happen in July.
Right.
That's when the next Pacific Islands Forum is going to occur. So it's interesting, because I think the New Zealand government shares the Australian and the American concerns about China's ambitions in the Pacific Island states, and particularly its authoritarian and quite assertive approach to small countries. And there's worries about debt traps, etc. But how do you respond to that without strengthening the Chinese challenge? You need to make sure that the countries which are coming under pressure from China have the wherewithal to make choices and have the ability to push back and say to China, no, we don't want that. We don't need to accept that.
Yeah.
If they're the only show in town and New Zealand and Australia and the United States are not actually really competing in terms of what can be offered, notice that the Chinese package included measures to deal with climate change. So the Chinese are quite aware that the Western countries haven't really fully addressed the concern of the Pacific Island states. Well, clearly, New Zealand and Australia, I think, and perhaps the United States, need to put together some sort of initiative which really does address climate change concerns that many Pacific Island states have. After all, the Pacific Island states look like, and are certainly at the moment, the biggest victims of climate change with rising sea levels, but they did nothing to create this problem.
Yeah.
So, in a sense, there is a moral, but also an important reason of self-interest for this carefully calibrated response to the Chinese competition. China's not going to go away. China's a superpower. We can't contain it. It's too big. And as you pointed out, China's our major trading partner.
Yeah.
So what we have to do, I think, is give the Pacific Island states the wherewithal to make choices and, if necessary, resist China. And hopefully China will learn that it can't just sort of establish a sphere of influence and effectively put its own people in power. And, this is not going to be done overnight, but I do think that's better than playing into Chinese propaganda by saying to the Pacific Island states, oh, we know what's best for you. We need to protect you from the authoritarian threat of China, which, viewed through the eyes of the Pacific Island states, will sound like very disrespectful. These are sovereign states, and also very patronizing. And that's what we've got to avoid.
Very good. From the University of Otago, Professor Robert Patman. Robert, thanks so much, as always, for joining us this evening.
Thank you.